computer. Okay. Then, okay, recording is running. I can say hello. Good, yeah, welcome to another session of Ask the Expert. Today we're talking about ZK event queues. Trying to cover a bit what the purpose of the event queues is, what they are meant to be used for, and what they are not meant to be used for. A few usage scenarios. Talking about the scopes, about the usage, of course, and outline a few alternatives. Because not everything requires event queues, and then the question is, what is the alternative? What can I use instead? And yeah, so my name is Robert. I'm working at ZK in the support and consulting team since at least 6 years now. So I'm dealing with most of customer requests regarding support and consulting. Yeah, and I think let's just dig into the project. Today, as always, I chose a runnable project because we look into code, and I used again Spring Boot project. The same project will also run without Spring Boot. I just use Spring Boot because it's a chance to test just the latest version. Sometimes I want to test if latest versions run. So I'm right now using Spring Boot 2.25 release. So the latest version. I use ZK9 also latest version. I have my compiler options to 1.8. Maybe that's why the null pointer exceptions don't work yet. But I'm running the project with JDK 14, which was just released yesterday, just to see also if things are running smoothly. Otherwise, the dependencies I'm running with Jetty, and I use ZK Max and ZUTI for a few templating features. But the event queues are available also without ZK Max. Just to illustrate a few, just make examples a bit shorter and use a few features when I think they are useful. Yeah, and in order to run the project, the run configuration is as simple as always. I run a Java class, activate the dev profile to have a bit better hotcode replacement and resource replacement in case we change some files. Otherwise, default run settings, no other configurations. Okay, and let's just run the project in debug mode so we can recompile. As you see, Java 14. And Spring Boot is starting, ZK is starting. I see my development configuration hint, so which is just here the development config, just setting a few, disabling all the caches so we can hot reload. And it activated by the profile. And the application itself is very simple today, just one mapping that maps the path into the page name. We've covered Spring Boot before, so nothing new here. And here are the code examples. Looks a lot. I hope we can go through all these. Otherwise, I'll provide the code later. After the, we'll provide the code as download for those who ask, including the recording video. So don't ask me in the chat. Just send an email back to, just reply to your invitation email if you are interested in the recording and the source code. Yeah, and we have a few pages we look into. And since the project is already running, runs after 7 seconds, usually a bit faster, but as always, with the screen sharing on, it takes a while to load. It's still my image. Let's see if this comes up later. Okay. So these are the examples I would like to go through. So we start with something simple, event queues. Just to outline the purpose, as the name says, event queues is some kind of communication channel to queue events and pass them and post them throughout the UI. Give the event queues have a name, so you can find the same channel by name again later. And in the first example, we just try to communicate between code-wise independent parts of the UI. And the classic example is always communication, navigation. So if you have some navigation components and you have some page components, and the navigation should update based on what the content is currently displaying, or vice versa, you need some kind of common event queue in ZK. So we have a Zool page. What I do is I have, of course, just a label outputting the desktop ID. I think we don't need it for the example, but I had a plan, forgot to remove it, so don't worry about it. It's not to confuse you, just to see we are on desktop. Navbar is my navigation component. So here there's one composer, and the other one is my content composer. I use purely Java here because the event queues happen mostly at the server side, and the composers will generate the UI via Java. You could use the same thing with a Zool file, but here I wanted to look into dedicated files just to get started easily. So we have the navigation composer. Now it will create a few navigation items inside the navbar component of a few children and add a click listener. And whenever we click this listener, it will publish one event into the navigation queue. And the content composer will then receive the event. It will subscribe to an event. So now we've seen already the first two API methods, which is subscribe and publish. Yeah, so far so easy. Question is, how do we get how do we get the event queue? And that's done by event queue lookup. I made a small, oh, someone is not muted. Wait, I will mute you. Okay. All right. I made a small util so I don't have to repeat the code all the time. So here I prepared a few queue names, just strings, a few event constants I use throughout the first examples. And yeah, the first example, how to find the queue, is event queues lookup. It's a static method. You can look up by name. You can look up by name and create if missing. So this is similar to call your application server to give you a session and say create a session if missing. So that's the same behavior here. So when this flag is true, it will automatically generate an event queue on demand, on first demand. And the last one is also equivalent, using the default scope, which is the desktop scope. And the desktop scope, the event queue, just means it will send, or it will send these events only to the current browser tab. Basically, one desktop is a browser tab in ZK. And this is what we do and what we need in navigation. In the navigation scenario, we have a navigation part, we have a content part, and the content just wants to know that navigation happened. So the navigation composer will trigger the onClick, or will publish an event into the event queue, and the content composer will simply subscribe to the event and output some labels. Of course, in a real world scenario, the content composer would load another Zool file on demand. But any kind of UI update is the same to me in this scenario. I just show something simple, but you can load a whole Zool file based on the navigation information. And instead of just sending a string, you can send whole objects. So here I just sent a string into the event, but this is any arbitrary object. Yeah, and if we run this example, here, if we run this, we will see our navigation bar at the top. We have a zoo, okay, it's just a desktop ID. And we have our three navigation components. When I click one, the content will just reply. You could have done this also by looking up components by ID and setting the content, but the idea here is to decouple both composers from each other, so you don't have to assume any component IDs from other parts of the UI. You just send the event with the information you want, and you can listen from as many pages or as many places as you like. Maybe update breadcrumbs with an event listener, update a footer, update the legal information, all based on the current navigation information, which could be a complex object with all your localization labels and privacy information and whatever you need for to display or to update your page. So the goal is you can have multiple parts of your UI that subscribe to the same event queue. I think that's a simple example to get started. Let's make this a bit more complicated. We just look into this again. So we also have a few more queues, event queues, because we have 4 different scopes or 4 basic scopes in ZK, which is desktop scope, we've already mentioned. So this time I don't give the queue a useful name anymore. I just call it desktop queue and group queue and session queue and application queue. And as said, desktop is one browser tab. I will skip group for a second. Session is corresponds to all the browser tabs that belong to the same session. So a browser will always share the session cookie between different browser tabs. So you can send events to all the browser tabs or pop-up windows or iframes of this user. And the application event queue will send to every desktop in every session that is, of course, subscribed and listening to these events. And the group scope is something in between, only available in ZK Max. I haven't seen this very often in the wild. And it's a bit special. I think it comes from the era when portals and portlets were more in fashion, and this will cover all the desktops within a browser tab. So it will communicate between iframes, for example. If you have a page with an iframe, you can send events only to the hosting page and the iframe, but not other browser tabs. So that's slightly special, but also I have an example for it. And well, to create the queues, you just provide different scopes and different names. And where these names are coming from is just a static import. It's the event queues class, which has these globals. Now, if we go there, there's the desktop scope, group scope, application scope, session scope. Okay, let's go to the example and just see what it does, and then we look how it's implemented. So we have, for this, I created 2 pages. One is the sending page. Oh, I need to copy the link, open a new tab. So we have a sending page that is sending events and receiving pages. And now we can check how the different scopes behave. For example, if I send a desktop scoped event, then only my current desktop will receive the event. It will display a notification when it receives the event, but nothing else. So the other desktop doesn't receive this. And also here's an iframe, which contains another receiver. So that we have 1, 2, 3 receiving components here. And right now only one receives it. If I use the group scope, as mentioned, it will send to the page itself, to the whole desktop, and to the iframe. So there's 2 components receiving these events. If I use the session scope, obviously all 3 receivers will receive the session, the event. So you see it happens 3 times. And if I want to simulate a different, give me the different a different session, I just use a different browser. So I have a different cookie storage and just open another receiver in another browser. And now if I send to application scope, also the other browser session will receive this. And this can be on a different computer, it can be a browser in a different machine. So again, desktop scope, single event, group scope, iframes, portlets, and on the same page, session within the same session, the same browser. These are just 2 browser tabs of the same browser, an application scope. Everyone on the application server who is subscribed currently. For example, if I remove, like we can remove these things dynamically. So I remove the iframe, for example, and I send a group broadcast, it will only be received one. If I remove the include, no one receives because no one is listening anymore. No one receives the message. Now, just look quickly into the code. Time is good. And we have the broadcast sending composer. Wait, what do the pages look like? Broadcast sender. As mentioned, there are a few buttons. There's the iframe and there's the include. This also works if you use the apply element with shadow elements. If you have ZK UTI and ZK Max available. Oh, I have first question. Is there an easy way to replicate event queues within clustered? That's exactly good question. I wanted to get to this later, but I can already say no. ZK does not have any inter application server event queues. So for this, you have to use some kind of third-party tool, maybe JMS queue, and then both applications can listen to the JMS queue and then broadcast into an application scoped event queue on both sides. But there's nothing for cluster environments. So good question, easy answer, it's not clustering. So these are the 4 scopes, and there's no 5th magic cluster over the world scope. Doesn't exist in ZK. ZK is front-end framework, and this would go more into the back-end. All right, so we have include component which will be part of the same desktop. An iframe, as said, is a new desktop, and that's why it only receives from the group scope. And then we have the receiving object, the receiving Zulha, which is just a composer which will listen to the event queues and then display the various notifications in the different corners of the screen. So the receiving composer is really simple. It is just listening to 4 different event queues, and it's using the subscribe annotation, which is a bit for convenience. I wanted to mention this in the navigation part. Navigation composer. Oh no, I took it out. The content composer. No, here. So instead of calling subscribe, you can also use the subscribe annotation. It has the same effect. So, and the subscribe annotation works with selector composers. I'll get back how to do this with MVVM later, but this is for the selector composer, this annotation. Okay, let's go back. So we have the broadcast receiver composer. It's just purely using these subscribe annotations. One benefit of the subscribe annotation is that it automatically unsubscribes from an event queue when the component that's hosting the composer is detached from the screen. I'll show an alternative later how to do this in any case, not only with selector composer. So this convenience is just for the simple example here. So I use my queue names, which are constants, and my event names I'm interested in, and it will listen to this queue and filter out events with this name, and then display just the message. And you see in different parts of the screen, so we can distinguish the different kind of messages. And the sender composer also looks trivial. There's 4 buttons. There's desktop, group, session, and application broadcast button ID. And it will just get the desktop queue, the group queue from my queues, like a factory, and publish. I would recommend doing some kind of queue factory object or class in your application, so that you don't have to hard code, or you don't accidentally hard code and forget to refactor event queue names and queue scopes. It's just much cleaner this way. Or even provide some more convenient methods, methods. Instead of saying publish on broadcast, maybe make a event queues broadcast or event queues navigate method, and which will internally do the ZK event logic, creating an event object, passing parameters. That's something you can do easily in some kind of utility object for these kind of events. Yeah, I think this is just simple. Yeah, there's nothing else to say. What we can look at slightly is in the browser, because there are two differences here. The desktop scope and the group scope, they work without server push, and the session scope and the application scope, they need server push in order to work. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to update browsers that currently have no user interaction. With a desktop scoped event queue, you always have a click event or some kind of user event that's coming in from the server, and then you update the desktop queue. So this can be used without server push, but at the session and application scoped, you need server push activated, and it will activate automatically whenever you subscribe to an event queue with this scope. So in here we see it will subscribe to the session scope and application scope, so it will instantly enable server push. That's why I put the comments here. If we comment this out, we just don't listen to these. Just restart the server. We just open the network tab so we can see what is happening here at the console level, the network level. I don't know, doc. And we reload the broadcast sender. So now, right now, we don't have any server push activated. That's something we would see from these ZK commit requests. Give me some more space. Okay, so we can only use desktop and group scope, and they work without server push on the session and application scope. They just don't do anything. It just send the click to the server, but no one is subscribed, so there's nothing happening. If we localhost, where's my IDE here? If you re-enable those two, does it work with hotcode replacement? No, it doesn't. It's a restart. Okay, just restart the server quickly. Okay, and if we reload, we can instantly see that it creates server push requests which are waiting for response. This is the long polling, and it also will work with WebSockets. But I created, I used server push so we see the connections more easily, and the messages are flowing. And as soon as you disconnect or unsubscribe, the server push will be stopped. So you see the server push, the commit requests no longer exist and no longer poll from the client side. I think that's this example. We make this a bit even more complicated in the next section when we talk about the life cycle of these event queues, how to deal a bit more in detail with attaching, reattaching, and what happens in these cases. And here I made the scenario again a bit simpler. I only distinguish between desktop scope and session scope because one uses server push, the other one doesn't use server push. The one can survive the current desktop and the other one can't. So I just would like to demonstrate what happens if you forget to unsubscribe to your server, to your event queue, and how to, of course, how to unsubscribe correctly. So right now, there is no listener attached. Just wanted to attach listeners on demand. And I have examples for MVC, MVVM, so everyone is happy. And just attach one. Right now we just broadcast, so you see no one is listening, nothing happens. This one is using the same receive. No, it's the same sending composer. So these two buttons are just the same buttons as of the previous example. Now we've seen them here in the sender composer. Yeah, it's using the desktop broadcast and the session broadcast. In the code, it's a bit simpler. It uses the same composer as before, and it has 2 buttons and a few more buttons that do something dynamic. Here I used inline script because I was too lazy to input this into the composer. Of course, you can set source of an include also from a composer or from MVVM with binding. Well, it's easier to follow from the UI point of view what's happening. So I have one button that will attach a Zool file. The other one will just remove the included Zool file. And here is the include component. And then we'll just observe. I'll just close this one for now. Observe how these get attached and detached. Where was I need to close a few windows. The broadcast sender we don't need. The receiver, sender, receiver. Oh, I just close all. And we just open again. We have the lifecycle sender, and we start with MVC. So here we have a composer. In the MVVM case, I have a view model, so it's roughly the same. So for the MVC case, we go into our composer. This composer will, in do after composer, common callback method for everyone. It will, I forgot what it does. Yeah, it will subscribe to event queues, to the desktop event queue, to the session events queue, and it will unsubscribe later. If we use the subscribe annotation here, this will happen automatically, but I want to do this manually so I can demonstrate what happens if we forget it. So right now, I subscribe to the listener, and this is something I want to say special, but something happened not too long, added not too long ago, are these component callbacks, some kind of component lifecycle callbacks. So instead of having to override a component to add the, or to override or implement the on page detached method, you can just add some kind of callback listener for a few events. There's not many. I think there's an after page attached, after page detached, child added, child removed. So these 4 lifecycle callbacks you can listen to. And whenever my current component here, that's my composer host component, whenever this one is detached, I also want to unsubscribe to my listeners. And let's demonstrate this. So we attach MVC, so the content, oops, I clicked in the wrong place, attach the lifecycle receiver. So that's the, right, this is the header of the MVC receiver. Yeah, that's the initial text, and it will append labels in between here whenever we receive an event. So we send a desktop event, it adds the desktop event, another one, or we send a session event, and it will attach the session message that was sent through the session scoped event queue. When we detach again, nothing happens, and also the commit server push has stopped itself. So we attach something, commit starts, detach, and the commit returns with 200 and is stopped. And now we break it. Now you forget to unsubscribe. We do is we attach an MVC composer, and now we clear the logs, because we also have server logs, just to see what we receive. So we broadcast a desktop event and a session scoped event, and we see the server side is called and the client side receives these event listeners. If we detach the current view and we trigger our event listeners, in this case they don't. I know. I need to recompile. I always forget this. And I hope the hot code replacement doesn't start. I need to restart. Okay, luckily this is not too slow. and we reload again. Okay, so we attach and we detach without unsubscribing. And now we broadcast our events. We see the server still does something, even though the component that initialized the composer is no longer there. This will most likely lead to null pointer exceptions or to weird scenarios. Here it doesn't hurt too much because I'm not accessing any components that try to update anymore, but very often you will just get the exception component does not belong to any desktop anymore. So, and also will result in memory leaks. If we attach again and detach and attach and detach, attach, detach, and we broadcast, we suddenly get lots of events in the in our logs. Now, even though everything looks all right, only one element, only one label is added, the server is way too busy. And for example, we also see here that these V layouts are all null. They don't belong to, they don't have a UUID anymore, so they don't, indicating they don't belong to a desktop anymore. So it's just a component that does not exist anymore in the current component tree, but it's still held or prevented from being garbage collected because the event queue subscription still exists that will call the callback method of the event listener. So our listener function here. So this listener will then prevent this composer from being garbage collected and the hosting component as well. But we can see it's being detached. It doesn't belong anymore to ZK because it doesn't have a component ID anymore. And the one that still belongs to the page, of course, has a component ID. So we just fix this again. Now we want to keep our application running. And why doesn't it support the hotcode replacement? Okay. Yeah, and of course, the wider the scope of these listeners, the worse the problem gets. If you forget to unsubscribe to an application scoped event queue, then even when users log out, no, not really, no. But when users refresh their screens a lot, they will just keep producing a growing number of event listeners, which just produce memory consumption and CPU usage if they do something heavy when the listener is called. So safe way, use the annotation if you use selector composer. Here in this case, I don't use selector composer, I just use the bare interface. I have to add the listener myself, the callback myself, and unsubscribe deliberately, so I don't forget it. And you have to use the same listener instance to unsubscribe. So you can't use the convenient Lambda syntax, inline this listener and then unsubscribe to the same thing. You have to first assign it to a variable so you can have the same instance. Okay, so that's a clean way to clean up. And with the view model, it looks almost the same. You have a view model, you subscribe, you unsubscribe. In a view model, you have a dedicated destroy annotation, also not too old. I don't know, when was this added? Since, I don't have the source right now, I think since ZK 8.5 or something, 8.5 or 8.6, we have the destroy annotation, so that a view model gets notified when its hosting component is detached. So that's the dealing with life cycles, or how to subscribe, unsubscribe from an event queue in a safe way, so you don't forget these kind of things. Yes, that's what I do here. I unsubscribe. Yes, we can try. We just we forget the unsubscription. Maybe I'm talking nonsense. This one works, the hotcode replacement. Okay, so we attach. We just reload the page. We attach our view model. We broadcast. Works. We detach and broadcast, and it still does something. So yes, you have to unsubscribe. Was one question. maybe there should be a simpler way to unsubscribe. There's one thing that fixes this problem. As soon as the desktop dies, the subscriptions will disappear. Another question from Prem. No, I said the annotation is used for selector composer. No. That's what it says. It's maybe not as convenient, but you have to. I'm here to say how it is. So the annotation we had here, the subscribe annotation. If we just go there, oh come on, don't I get sources today? The eval version doesn't have sources today. Okay, we will go there later. But the subscribe annotation is only parsed in the selector composer. But I will give you an alternative I prefer anyway to event queues in some cases. Especially for desktop event queues, you don't always have to use event queues, but later more on the more about this. So now yeah, I hope this answers the question. So no, in MVVM you have to, or in the view model you can unsubscribe, or you have to unsubscribe, and you can do this in the destroy method of your view model. And there's one scenario that fixes the problem. If we open the browser again, and that is if we create our memory leak. Do we still have it? And we detach, clear this one, and oh, I clicked at the wrong place. Attach, and resend. Oh, I'm clicking at the wrong places. Yeah, it's already fixed. Control recompile. By the way, from the annotation, you can see that it's specific for the selector composer because the annotation is from the package UI select. This means it's for the selector composer and not for the view model. Of course, you could initialize this. No, don't know. It's a convenience, and it's possible without this. Where was I? So I wanted to break this again and show you how the problem fixes itself if you forget to detach. So desktop, nothing. We attach MVVM, so we have our listeners. We detach and we broadcast again, so it still is a problem. If I refresh the screen, I haven't cleaned up the event listeners, and I broadcast again, both the session and the desktop listeners are gone. So they are still, the event listeners are still attached to a desktop, and if the desktop is cleaned up, it will clean up all the listeners that were created during the lifetime of this desktop. So it's not an infinite memory leak, but it's a memory leak for the lifetime of the current desktop. So that's, but if you heavily attach, detach components, then this will be at least expensive, if not damaging to your overall performance. So if the users refresh their screen, the event queue listeners will be gone. Okay, let's refix the problem. Any other questions about this one? Not right now. Okay, then we just, how much time? 20, oh, we're running out of time again. So let's go to the long operations, because event queues can also be used not only for talking to independent parts of the UI, they can also be used, and that's often confusing, to synchronize between UI tasks and background tasks. We call them asynchronous task and synchronous task. Async is the background stuff, where ZK is not waiting, and we have synchronous task where ZK is waiting. This is quite a complex topic. That's why I added lots of examples here. So 4 different alternatives. they will mostly do the same. So we have a long operation that starts at server side and at some point finishes, starts and finishes. And what I do here is, in the first example, I use event queues to and create two different subscriptions. I use the desktop scoped event queue here because that's I think the most common case, and I can subscribe in two different ways, either with the parameter true or with the parameter not existing or false. True means this is an async listener, so this listener will run in a separate thread, and it will not block the UI. So that's where you can do your heavy job. Query your database and wait until the database finished filtering, while the user can still use the front end. Or what I do here, I just display the busy overlay. The busy overlay is just an effect. It doesn't have any meaning. The UI is still responsive, so I can remove this. I just remove the show busy, so that we can start multiple tasks at the same time. So we start and start more. It's starting, and then one after another finish. And this, similar to the session scoped event queues, is here. As soon as you subscribe an async listener with true, it will enable the server push for this desktop. That's something we can see here in the log. The commit request will start, and it will finish, and it will not restart anymore, so it will continue polling. Or if I have multiple tasks, it will wait until the last task is finished and then stop the server push again. Because server push is kind of expensive. It keeps the connection open, especially if you don't use WebSockets. It's an additional connection, and connections are limited in most browsers. Yeah, what we do and how it works. I'll just clear the log, so we see a single case. So it will, whenever you publish an event to an event queue that has two different listeners, a synchronous and async listener, it will call all the listeners, and you have to do the event filtering yourself. So I post an event start and an event done. The start event I handle in my asynchronous listener. Maybe just check. Oh no, I handle it in both. The start event I handle in both. So I display my show busy, or output some logs, or update some labels, or disable parts of the UI, remove parts of the UI. I'll come back to your question. And the done event I only handle in the synchronous listener, because I want to restore the UI, clear the busy overlay, show some feedback, add some labels, add elements to a list model, add list items, whatever you can do after your long operation is done. What I also do here is I give my event queue a unique name, so that I don't accidentally paste event to other parts of my application. Just generate a random UUID. It's up to you how you call it. I just use something random, and then I can be sure that no one else is on this event queue in my desktop. And one important part, and when I'm done with my task, I publish another event from this async listener. So it's possible to publish events from asynchronous listeners. And then the done event I only handle here, clear busy. And what I do in the end is I remove my event queue from the event queues list with using the same UUID, so that the server push can then stop. Sometimes, from time to time, I mix this up and I try to use event queue.close, but this will not work. It will stop the server push too early, and then these updates will not be pushed to the client side. So use event queues remove as the counterpart to event queues.lookup. get and create something on demand, remove something when no longer needed. Don't delete too early. Now you can. This is just a string. You can use any arbitrary string here. It doesn't matter. It's just a string I use for this example. I find it even slightly annoying that you have to use an event object, but that's the API right now. So it's custom. So now I get back to question from Prem Kumar. In MVVM, using annotations, can we use async queues? Async queues in MVVM, and which annotation? That's the question. Which annotation? Because this one is the Java API, and in this event, async true false is only available in the subscribe Java API. In MVVM, yeah, you just do event queues lookup in the same way. There's no difference. Annotations are sometimes overrated. You have to do the same job. You have to think about the same code. And if there's an annotation, it sometimes makes it harder for someone to read. But because this one is already complicated enough, I think we only have this one. If this is a bit too annoying, yeah, you have to publish an event in the beginning. Yeah, I publish my start event. After I set up my listeners, then the start listener will be triggered. Then the done event will be triggered, and it will be processed here after the 2 seconds. There's a shortcut for this very common scenario where you have a start and an end of a long operation, which is the subscribe function with 2 event listeners, where the first event listener is the async listener, and the second one is the sync listener. You don't have to deal with specific event names. You just publish one event in the beginning. And this event will be the same in the sync listener and the async listener, and the synchronous listener, where you can update the UI, will wait for the other one to finish before this one is called. It's a shortcut. Do your long operation, do something after the long operation. Easiest way. Just subscribe with 2 listeners. Now you see there's one listener with a Boolean flag for async, and the 2 listener and callback. And that's, I would say, the simplest case, but limited to exactly this scenario when you have a long operation first and then some UI updates in the end. And also you can see I do my show busy not in a listener. I just do this directly during the click operation. And for MVVM, this one would be a command handler. So it would be the same code, just a command method. Then a few alternatives. If you need more flexibility, yeah, you can always do executions activate and executions deactivate. This is, I think, the lowest level API you can use. Activate means I get access to components. I can create components, remove components, send server push to the client information, and everything outside this execution activate deactivate block is my long operation. So this way you could chain multiple UI updates interleaved with background process. The slight challenge here is, on the challenge, what you need to be aware of is this one is blocking. So whenever you do this, the whole thread will block until the UI update is done. If you want to do something like display 10%, 20%, 50%, 100%, some kind of in-between stages, you can use another convenience method, which is the schedule events, and which is non-blocking. So you can have an effect like, by the way, the other 2 behave the same. Yeah, it starts, it ends. This one starts and ends. I think I don't use show busy here, but it's the same effect. And this one will show some intermediate step. You see there's a 50% step. Started 50% done. And Andrea Palma, the activate deactivate works even when I use add child, remove child. Yes, inside the activate deactivate block, you can add and remove elements. You can change not elements, components. You can change component properties. You can add elements to a list model, which will then update and create list items in a list box or grid rows in a grid. It doesn't speed up anything. It just does the thing. And you can only do it in between activate deactivate. And this activate deactivation happens automatically when using the async and synchronous listener from the event queue, or it also happens automatically when you use the executions.schedule convenience, or how to say, convenience method, because this one will run this intermediate step in a separate thread, so that my long operation that maybe did the database query, and then after this needs to do some expensive filtering in a second step, it can do this. It can continue doing the long operation, and this one will just go into a separate event queue, or not event. Yeah, it will be handled in a separate event queue technically, but it will just happen outside of your thread. The only thing happening in your thread is the method call to schedule, and then it will schedule this for the desktop. So you don't have to always activate deactivate yourself. Alternatively, or the same, you could do when instead of blocking here, you could just call another run async. Just run the activate deactivate block in another in a separate thread. It's the same as here schedule. Another benefit of schedule is if you call multiple schedules in very short succession, there's a chance that they arrive at the client side in the same response. Whereas if you call activate deactivate, each of them will produce a separate request response cycle for the client. So be aware when you do activate deactivate, you should always, if possible, batch a few updates in one. So don't make many activation deactivations, because it will produce a request response cycle for each operation. Not a good not good performance. And schedule, as said, has the benefit. It will be the events can be processed in the same request response cycle, but since it happens in a separate thread, there's also a chance that maybe if you have 100 schedules, that the first 50 are processed once, and then the next 50 are processed in another thread. So this is undefined how it behaves. They will just be processed in order. Okay, and in the end, I also schedule my clearing busy event. One important thing is when you're dealing with activate deactivate, you have to start the server push yourself. Event queues do this automatically. Here you enable server push myself. I use a more internal function here. It's available to you. You can use it, which is enable server push with an ID, and the ID will be used. Must just be a unique object. It will be used for reference counting. So you can have multiple threads that enable server push, and when every ID is disabled, then the server push will also be disabled from the desktop. So you don't have server push running longer than necessary. That's why you have to cast to desktop control. It's a slightly more technical API than just calling desktop enable server push, which will be global on or off. Maybe it's bad if you disable server push too early while other processes are still running, and then they will block. That said, internal API handle with care. And also here, if you're dealing with threads yourself, you have to enable server push also yourself. At least the schedule is a bit more convenient if you need the fire and forget behavior of events. Sorry about this. Oh. And now we're, as always, running out of time. Just a quick overview on the alternatives. Now, if you want to communicate between nested parts of your UI, the classic example is with a view model. You have an outer view model, you have an inner view model, and you want to send message from outer to inner or from inner to outer, and using an event queue is often, in my opinion, overkill, because you can just use Java to send events back and forth, or not send events, just call methods. Huh? That's the most natural way of sending messages between objects, is calling a method. Classic OO. Okay, there's another question. I'll get back to this. I just quickly go over this one. So what is often overlooked is in the MVVM and also in the MVC scenario, you can you don't have to specify a composer or a view model by class. Very often, people think they're limited to using a class name here, but you can also pass an object, just an object, which is just a variable in the scope of the current page or of the current components. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating the inner view model as a Java object inside my outer view model, and then I'm just passing this variable into my nested page. And the same with composer. I'm passing the composer variable, any kind of name, yeah, can be any name. I'm passing a parameter into my apply. Also works with includes. Slightly, it's a bit dodgy. That's why apply was introduced. And here I can just apply the composer by object reference. And then I have all the possibilities of the Java language, how to call methods and how to override methods to get back and forth. What you could do, this could be a Spring Bean. Yeah? You can have a Spring Bean that's injected into multiple places and then just call methods on this kind of Spring Bean. ZK Spring has a desktop scope that ensures that the same object is only created once in a desktop. So you can have some kind of communication hub object for the desktop that you inject into every view model or into every composer, which can then do Java-based communication between objects. Now you don't need event queues for everything. How I do this is in the outer view model, I create the inner view model, maybe with parameters, and I just override a method that the inner view model provides and calls. Or on the other way, I just call a method directly from the inner view model. I don't need the event queue to communicate between the two. Just call a method. Easier to debug, have a nice stack trace if something goes wrong. And in the opposite way, then the inner view model will just provide a protected method. You can even make it abstract if you want to force the user to override it, and then you have an in and out channel of an object. And the same with composer, the same pattern. Just provide a protected method that is called when the inner composer receives some kind of click event or whatever, and you want to send the outer. Maybe tell the outer component that the user that has filled out everything in the address form and he wants to close it. And then the outer composer can detach the hosting component of this one. So nice alternative to event queues without event queues, just use Java. So now go back to the question. There was some random deadlock. Yes, threads often have deadlocks when using server push, as explained in ZK code itself. Any update on that issue, more especially when we can't use WebSocket? If you, I think, if you have our support, just ask, create a ticket or something, because I don't know which ticket you're talking about. Because a random deadlock could be any kind of thing. If you can provide the code number, the ticket number or the issue number, we can look. But random deadlock sounds like I don't know right now about the random deadlocks. During my testing here, I didn't see any deadlocks, but I know that there are sometimes issues which are fixed in versions. But if you want an update, please tell me exactly what the issue is. Maybe send an email to our just respond to your invitation email, so we can follow up on this one, because I don't have it in my head right now. I don't know which task this is. Okay. Now the question gets more complicated. Okay. Now I'll get back to you offline, because we're running out of time right now. can't talk about this one anymore. Are there any questions related to this current project? Right. One thing I forgot to mention, training notes, is other third-party tools. For example, if you need more complicated thread control, use something like RxJava or Reactor to deal with multiple threads, multiple event sources, merging events into a single thread, and then in the end, publish an event into a ZK event queue. So all the business logic, you don't have to use ZK event queues for your whole business logic. These are used for the UI and not for your backend. So for your backend, use a dedicated framework like RxJava, Reactor. That are the ones I've heard of. I think there's more. Reactive Streams as the API that's based on this. Or if you need distributed things, JMS, I don't know, Redis, there are other frameworks for that support clustering. And then whenever you receive a message from one of these distributed subscriptions, you can then funnel them into event queues from ZK at the different cluster nodes. In MVVM, using annotations can we use async queues? I still don't understand the question. I mentioned already, in the view model, you just call the same Java code as in my example. You say subscribe, look up, publish, subscribe. It's the same always. And you can do this in an event listener, or you can do this in a command handler, and the command handler was using annotations. So I don't know exactly why you're asking again. If this is not fully clear, then maybe also ask our support, because I can't, really running out of time. So any other questions? Otherwise, I will stop the current recording. Okay, then I will stop the recording. Okay. The GitHub page of all examples. That would be nice to have a GitHub page with all examples. What we can do is we can provide the source code of this project, the code here in this example, if you reply to the invitation email asking for the video recording and the source code. All right, I will stop the recording now.